In the Pursuit of Truth. Dao Li. Chapter 2. People. Part 1. Democracy for the people. Dictatorship over the reactionaries. Mao Zedong. During those early years in Communist China, the word people had an official and a political definition that could not be found in most English dictionaries. If a certain social class belonged to the realm of the people, they were supposed to be politically safe. The antonyms of people were reactionaries and enemies. To make the situation even more precarious, the line between people and enemy moved quite often. Ordinary citizens never knew what the reason was, whether it was by their own actions or words, or factors completely out of their control. All of a sudden, many found themselves falling into the category of the country's enemy. So it happened in the infamous anti-rightists movement of 1957, when DR was still in elementary school. That year, more than 500,000 Chinese intellectuals found out the reality of China's new democracy under the communists in a hard way. They were first encouraged by Mao to express different views and critiques on national policy, but then were purged as rightists for just doing so. Intellectuals were never a social and a political force that the government relied on, but they still, at least theoretically, belong to the category of the people. But those among them labeled as the rightists became class enemies. You could imagine what kind of hardship and plight they and their families were thrown into. Mao called his conspiracy a strategy of enticing the snakes out of their caves. Street talk courts disaster, as a well-known Chinese idiom teaches us. Sincerity and candidness had always been respected as a good moral character. The tragedy, however, seemed inevitable, as intellectuals tend to have strong urges to opine. It is just their second nature, and Chinese intelligentsia were no exception. Unfortunately, those who suffered the most were the cream of the crop, both in talent and character. DR's father was a bit luckier at the time, but he did not go through the political movement without a good scare. DR came back home from the summer camp, and at the dinner table his parents were talking with a quite serious tone. Neither seemed to be in good mood. DR sensed something important was happening, and he listened attentively. "I heard Dr. Yang may be in trouble," Mother said, referring to an old friend living nearby. His wife dropped by, looking very concerned. "You know, he just has a big mouth." "I can also feel the mounting pressure these days in the medical school," Father said. "What is going on?" "We have had meetings after meeting. Everyone had to say something. Keeping silent was not an option, and it would be considered a wrong attitude." "So you said something, I suppose, to criticize the erroneous view of the rightists," Mother said. But to find anything worth saying was not an easy task. I really cudgeled my brain, Father said. He finally came up with the following remark. Rightists say there is a war separating the party and the people. In my opinion, it is not accurate. And the most you can say is there may be a fence in between. You can see the other side that you cannot reach. This is what happened to an academically oriented man forced to address the political issues. What he said was not forgotten. Nearly a decade later, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, one of the posters by the radicals labeled him a rightist who escaped the net of the anti-rightist campaign. The 1957 campaign was like a tornado touchdown that came without warning. Where it hit hard. And to those who bore the brunt of it, the blow was absolutely devastating. For D.R.'s father, it was like his neighbors' houses were demolished. But he was lucky to only have a couple of broken windows. But now, years later, the Cultural Revolution was like a massive hurricane sweeping over a vast land. No one could escape its wrath. So far, in the family conversation, D.R.'s parents had not touched upon the sensitive subject of the decision in 1949 facing the communist takeover. In retrospect, it seemed to be something they could have and should have done differently. But now, facing the stern political reality, they simply could not dwell on the regret. It took the collective will of the family and their love for one another to survive. Unfortunately, the persecution continued to escalate. In the first year of the Cultural Revolution, D.R.'s father was targeted as a capitalist academic authority for his early education in the West. He became a subject of political criticism on a routine basis. Using a prevalent political jargon those days, it was a situation of having one's soul touched, not a serious matter in average people's eyes. Now, into the third year of the revolution, he began to be targeted for his previous service in an army hospital run by the former nationalist government. And the accusation against him carried a more vicious tone and brought graver repercussion. His family was kicked out of their residence, and soon after, he was no longer allowed to practice medicine and ordered to do janitor's work at the clinic. His salary was cut by 90%. The professor grew up in southern China. He was infected with typhoid when he was a child. But miraculously, his father cured him with limited knowledge of Chinese herbal medicine acquired by self-study. The wonder of medicine became inspirational. Later, the family decided to send their son to a missionary school in Shanghai, and then to the famous Peking Union Medical College, PUMC, run by the Rockefeller Foundation. When he was in his senior years at PUMC, he met his mentor, a professor of ophthalmology from Austria. The professor was impressed by this young man's talent and dedication to learning, and asked if his favorite student wished to study medicine in Austria. He received his father's firm support, and in Vienna he began the new path to his medical career. Soon the Chinese Red Army took control of his native town, and his financial support from the family was cut off. But he persevered by way of work-study program. By the time he finally received his medical degree and completed his residency, he could have chosen to stay in Europe. But his motherland was in dire situation. Japan had invaded and occupied Manchuria, and he decided to return to serve his own country. As the ship passed by the famous Mountain Sea Pass, in Chinese called Shanghai Guan, he wept at the sight of the Japanese flags hanging from the Great Wall. Back in China, he was in time for leading some medical rescue mission in Shanghai when the Japanese Air Force bombed the city residential area. Then he retreated with the hospital to inner provinces as the Japanese troops advanced. The family had to move once every few months. They lived in makeshift housing, and every time they relocated, most furniture had to be left behind. Later, they could only afford simple and cheap furniture made of bamboo. On the road of migration to the West England, life became harder and the food ever so spicier. After finally reaching Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, D.R.'s father joined the army hospital and continued teaching and practicing medicine. He could have settled down in Shanghai's concession districts, still under Western jurisdiction, and opened a private clinic for a comfortable living. But instead, he chose otherwise. In spite of all the hardships, he had no regret and no complaint. He moved willingly and voluntarily. It was for the country, and it was fulfilling the duty of a patriot. However, he could not have predicted that working briefly for an army hospital would get him into deep trouble later in his life. As a professor and a doctor in Chongqing's army hospital then, he received a compensation equivalent to that of a major general. This was all the revolutionary mass needed to trump up their charge and put him into a different political category, class enemy, 25 years later. How was the professor's life as a janitor? Stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for listening and sharing with others.